Hello, my name is Chandler Juneau. I'm an undergraduate student majoring in psychology at UL, and today we're talking about the physiological impacts of addiction and the choice versus disease model. To get started, let's define addiction. Merriam-Webster defines it as a compulsive, chronic, physiological or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects, and typically causing well-defined symptoms. It's generally agreed upon that addiction is any repetitive pleasure-seeking behavior where the choice of short-term reward is taken regardless of long-term consequences. Now, this definition can be interpreted two different ways depending on what side of the question, is addiction a disease, you fall on. It all comes up to whether the choice for that short-term pleasure is a realistically conscious, weighed choice, or can it be equated to an insatiable need such as hunger or thirst, where logic can be absent at times. If the first is true, addiction can be viewed as a personal choice and an explanation for spontaneous remission. If the latter is true, addiction is most certainly not a choice, but a chronic disease. Well, that brings us to the question, what is disease? As you can see, Webster's definition is a condition of the living animal or plant body or one of its parts that impairs normal functioning and is typically manifested by distinguishing signs and symptoms. While this definition is a constant and understandable statement in the medical world, the lens with which we perceive diseases has changed and continues to change today. Now that we have our definitions, some backstory on our opposing opinions. The idea that addiction is a choice can be fitted appropriately by the choice model. This model is similar to that of an economic model, in which decisions are made regarding cost and reward. An addict might take drugs for short-term pleasure without feeling any consequences. Eventually, though, as consequences worsen to a point outweighing the benefits, the user will stop. This model provides a sensible explanation for why the estimated number of spontaneous remission cases in addiction is so high. The choice model is also highly critical of the biomedical model, declaring it dated and unfit for modern medicine. The biomedical model is not dissimilar to the disease model of addiction and is thus supported by those who agree with the notion that addiction is a disease. Put simply, the biomedical model states that when perceiving a disease, genetic, environmental, and biological factors should be examined. Specifically, those factors of a condition that can be measured and empirically tested. That is not to say that no research has been done on the other side. Experts have examined modern frameworks for perceiving disease alongside the addict condition, and some have concluded that addiction does not count as a modern disease when compared to more physiological illnesses. The modern framework used by these experts was originally proposed by American psychiatrist George Engel in 1977. Engel was critical of the biomedical model and admitted he thought it had no place in modern medicine. Therefore, he developed a way of interpreting disease that considered biological, such as genetic history, psychological, such as mental health, and sociological factors, such as socioeconomic status, and he called it the biopsychosocial model. When addiction is viewed through the lens of the biopsychosocial model, it's difficult to label it as a disease. To those who take this opinion, the psychological choice simply takes up too large of a role in addiction for the condition to be considered a physiological disease. Meaning, in contrast to the biomedical or disease model of addiction, addicts are making choices. They are choosing to use, no matter the well of necessity this decision comes from. According to some experts, the biomedical model of addiction can be harmful in some situations. Baconia explained their fear that the model is profit-seeking in nature and a way for pharmaceutical companies to increase sales by keeping the incurable myth of addiction intact, thereby blocking therapeutic paths of treatment. The other major potential danger of the biomedical model is that it can completely compromise a patient's recovery. No matter which side of the argument you agree with, it is publicly known that addicts are commonly desperate. The hope for a better life is diminished at best, non-existent at worst. Telling someone their condition is a brain disease could be the information they needed to absolve themselves of the want for recovery. Another worry in a different direction is that if addiction is classified as a brain disease within the addiction treatment community, it will prompt research to look for a cure in the brain. Hall and his colleagues say that this is the present state of research and it's currently ineffective. So what would be a more straightforward explanation of how addiction is not a disease? Goal-directed choice. A review conducted in 2020 by Hogarth analyzed addiction in both humans and lab animals under negative circumstances and found that addiction is driven by goal-directed choice over pure habit or compulsion. I feel that it's important to note here that I found little up-to-date, relevant research concluding outright that addiction is not a disease. More so, many experts condemn the idea of a purely biomedical model of addiction becoming the standard. Now, what if we were to look at addiction through the biomedical method? In this case, different questions entirely arise centered around the physiological debilitating symptoms of addiction. A biomedically inclined professional would seek to understand the neurochemical processes underlying the condition. In their way of thinking, treating the disease at the physical root of its cause is the best option for treatment. But what does this mean? For most, this means examining empirical data. In this sense, the dopamine hypothesis would be an appropriate claim for research in biomedical addiction. While the brain uses the dopamine reward system as a means for motivation, recent progress in molecular structural brain research has asserted that certain substances can take complete control of this system. In this instance, there is serious imbalance in the neurochemistry of the patient to a point where making informed choices becomes impossible. Another example of observing the physiological effects of addiction can be found in a review by Ranjbar and their colleagues. They reviewed literature that studied the changes that occur in the cerebellum initiated by heavy opioid use. The researchers call for more concrete, testable data to be collected in the field, as the current points to the cerebellum playing at least a partially active role in opioid addiction. Now that we've explained both sides, we can ask the real questions. Why argue? Why does any of this matter? Well, most importantly, it matters for the patients themselves. Disease or not, research shows that a patient's perception of their own condition can have critical consequences on their health, both mental and physical. With many other impairing conditions, it is common practice to explain the full depth and severity of the illness. Thus, the same may be said for addiction for a patient to truly understand what they are experiencing biologically. The call for more biological research has been echoed throughout the addiction treatment community for over a decade. This aligns with changes prospected by Dacus and O'Brien in 2005, in which they also emphasize why the public's opinion is just as important as the opinion of the scientific community in enacting true political change. There might always be a stigma associated with addiction, and that is a major problem. The idea that physically dependent addicts choose to use and remain in the conditions they are in is not scientifically based. Prejudgments such as these have been proven to vastly increase stress in those affected, making the revelation of life goal discrepancies in behavior even harder. At the end of the day, empirically based scientific research needs to be conducted and replicated in order to form addiction treatment that actually works.